My presentation is titled The Monster Within, Gender, Sexuality, and the Vampire. In this video, I will compare Bram Stoker's Dracula, Literary Criticism, and Robert Eggers' 2024 film Nosferatu, to examine how vampire stories reflect changing ideas of gender, sexuality, and power. Although these works are separated by more than a century, they reveal how cultural fears surrounding women and sexuality have evolved over time. And as you can see here, Count Orlok is as a shadow behind Ellen. That can be caused by her because she's a woman. Okay, let's move on. For more than a century, vampires have remained one of the most recognizable figures in Gothic literature and horror films. Although they are often portrayed as supernatural monsters, vampire stories reveal much more than a fear of the unknown. They reflect the beliefs, anxieties, and social values of the societies in which they are created. Bram Stoker's Dracula, first published in 1897, explores Victorian concerns about gender roles, sexuality, and morality. More than 100 years later, Robert Eggers' 2024 film Nosferatu revisits these themes from a modern perspective, giving audience a new interpretation of the classic vampire story. This presentation examines how Dracula reveals the relationship between gender and sexuality, and how that relationship reflects Victorian society's expectations of both women and men. By comparing the novel Literary Criticism and the 2024 film Nosferatu, this presentation explores how these ideas have evolved over time while continuing to shape the modern interpretations of the vampire genre. My research question is, how does the novel reveal the interconnection between gender and sexuality, and what are the effects of this connection? Bram Stoker's Dracula reveals that gender and sexuality are deeply interconnected, portraying challenges to traditional gender roles as sources of fear while reflecting Victorian anxieties about femininity and masculinity. Robert Eggers' 2024 film Nosferatu reinterprets these ideas by presenting women with greater agency, demonstrating how cultural attitudes toward gender and sexuality have evolved over time. One of the clearest ways Dracula reveals the connection between gender and sexuality is through the characters of Lucy Westenra. But before becoming a vampire, Lucy is portrayed as kind, innocent, and admired by several men. However, she also expresses thoughts that challenge Victorian expectations of women. In a letter to Mina, she jokes, "Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble?" Stoker 65. Although Lucy says this playfully, her comment indicates a level of independence and openness about relationships that Victorian society considered inappropriate for women. After Lucy becomes a vampire, Stoker writes, "The sweetness was turned to adamine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to Voluptas Wantoninus." 199. Her transformation from an innocent woman into a seductive vampire symbolizes the belief that female sexuality becomes dangerous when it exists outside traditional gender expectations. Literary critic Phyllis Roth reinforces the interpretation, arguing, "Perhaps nowhere is the dichotomy of Perhaps nowhere is the dichotomy of sensual and sexless women more dramatic than it is in Dracula, and nowhere in the suddenly sexual women more violently and self-righteously persecuted than in Stoker's thriller." 544. Roth explains that the novel separates women into 2 opposing categories: the pure, respectable woman and the sexually expressive women. Lucy's transformation, therefore, represents more than becoming a vampire. It reflects Victorian fears that women who embrace sexual independence threaten the social order by portraying Lucy's sexuality as monstrous and punishing her for crossing accepted gender boundaries. Stoker demonstrates how closely gender and sexuality are connected, supporting the idea that Victorian society viewed challenges to traditional femininity as both immoral and dangerous. And as you can see here, before you can see that she is pure, and then when she transforms, she turns into this cruel creature. While Lucy represents the consequences of challenging Victorian expectations, Mina Harker represents the qualities that society rewards. Throughout Dracula, Mina remains loyal to her husband while using her intelligence to help the group defeat Count Dracula. And like Lucy, Mina's knowledge and independence are accepted because they do not challenge the traditional ideas of femininity. Van Helsing recognizes balance when he says, "She has a man's brain, a brain that a man should have were he much gifted, and a woman's heart." Stoker 2:19. His description suggests that Mina's intelligence is admirable only because it combined with the compassion, loyalty, and purity expected of Victorian women. However, despite her intelligence and valuable contributions, Mina is still limited by her gender. When the group prepares to confront Dracula, Van Helsing declares, "We men are determined. Nay, are we not pledged to destroy this monster? But it is no part for a woman." Stoker 2:20. This statement demonstrates that even Mina's intelligence cannot overcome Victorian expectations about women's proper place in society. Although she is respected for her knowledge and loyalty, the men still believe she should be protected rather than allowed to participate equally. Literary critic Barbara Creed expands on this idea by arguing that Dracula connects sexuality with monstrosity. She explains, "For Dracula, sex is a cannibalistic act. Society does not endorse sex in excess. The culture represents such excess as persevere animalistic and feminine." Creed 556. Creed argues that Stoker uses vampirism to symbolize forbidden desire and the fear of women who possess sexual power. When compared with Lucy, Mina demonstrates that women who followed Victorian expectations were accepted and protected, while women who expressed sexuality outside those expectations were portrayed as dangerous. Through this contrast, Stoker reinforces the close relationship between gender and sexuality, showing how Victorian society judged women based on whether they conformed to traditional ideals of femininity. While Dracula reflects Victorian fears about surrounding female sexuality, Robert Eggers' 2024 film Nosferatu reinterprets these themes through the character of Ellen. Although the film continues exploring desire, power, and obsession, it presents Ellen as a more active participant in the story rather than a simple victim of the supernatural forces. Ellen tells Count Orlok, "I have felt you like a serpent crawling in my body," revealing that her struggle is both physical and emotional. Nosferatu 2024. Later, Orlok tells Ellen, "Soon I will be no more a shadow to you. Your spirit was never enough. Soon our flesh shall embrace, and we shall be as one." Nosferatu 2024. Together, these exchanges show that the relationship is rooted in desire, control, and possession rather than love. Instead of presenting sexuality as simply something to be feared or punished, the film portrays it as a complex influence that shapes Ellen's identity while also revealing Orlok's obsession with power. Unlike Lucy, whose sexuality is portrayed as dangerous and ultimately punished, Ellen plays an essential role in determining the story's outcome. Her choices and actions demonstrate greater independence and agency than Stoker's female characters are allowed to express. Rather than presenting female sexuality solely as something that threatens society, Eggers' portrayal portrays Ellen as a complex character whose strength becomes central to confronting evil. By reshaping the role of the heroine, Nosferatu demonstrates shifting cultural attitudes toward women while continuing to explore the relationship between gender, sexuality, and power. Together, Dracula and Nosferatu demonstrates that although vampire stories continue to examine these themes, the way that they portray women has evolved in step with society's changing expectations over the years. My counter argument is, are Dracula and Nosferatu simply a gothic horror? Some readers argue that Dracula is simply a gothic horror novel intended to entertain readers with vampires, suspense, and supernatural events, rather than to comment on gender or sexuality. While the novel certainly contains many traditional elements of gothic fiction, the repeated contrast between Lucy and Mina suggests that Bram Stoker intentionally explores the Victorian ideas about gender and sexuality. Lucy is punished after expressing thoughts and behaviors that challenge the normal Victorian expectations of female purity, while Mina is praised for remaining loyal, intelligent, and devoted to her husband. This contrast demonstrates that the novel does more than tell a vampire story. It reflects the social values of the Victorian era. Literary critic Phyllis Roth supports this interpretation by arguing that Dracula divides women into opposing roles, based on sexuality, supporting the ideas that female sexual expression was viewed as threatening within the Victorian society. Likewise, literary critic Talia Scalfer argues that the relationship between Count Dracula and Jonathan Harker challenges the Victorian ideas of masculinity, writing that it implies intimacy, acquaintance within contours of each other's bodies, ease with the prospect of each other's nakedness. 562. Scalfer's analysis shows that the novel questions traditional expectations of masculinity just as it examines femininity. Together, these examples show that Dracula uses Gothic horror to explore anxieties surrounding gender and sexuality, supporting the argument that these themes are central to the novel rather than purely a backdrop to its supernatural plot. Dracula has remained one of the most influential works of Gothic literature because its themes remain among modern audiences. By examining the novel alongside literary criticism and Robert Eggers' 2024 film Nosferatu, it becomes clear that vampire stories are more about the supernatural monsters. They reveal how ideas of gender and sexuality are created by the societies in which they are created. Through the contrast portrayals of Lucy and Mina, Stoker reflects Victorian anxieties surrounding women's roles, female sexuality, and masculine identity. More than a century later, Nosferatu reimagines these themes through Ellen presenting a heroine with great agency while continuing to explore the relationship between gender, sexuality, and power. Although the settings and characters have evolved, both works demonstrate that Gothic literature reflects cultural fears and values. Ultimately, the continuing popularity of vampire stories shows that while the monsters remain the same, the fears they represent continue to change with society. And again, we have Nosferatu and Dracula right beside each other. And then this is my works cited of all the works that I have used. So we have Creed Barbara, Nosferatu, Roth Phyllis, Talia Scalfer, and Bram Stoker. And that's it.